Last topic, I introduced to you the idea of symbols and how we can use symbols to get at things like people's identities. For this topic, we're going to be looking at another mechanism or another aspect of worldview, which is that of religion and specifically ritual. So, what do anthropologists mean when we talk about religion? Well, we mean this, that it's any set of attitudes, beliefs, and practices pertaining to supernatural powers. And so, one of the things anthropologists do when we examine religions is attempt to understand what these attitude, beliefs, and practices are and attempt to define what what supernatural powers are and how they are understood. Of course, the reason why we're very interested in religion is because it is such an important force or structure or institution in many societies. But one of the areas that we're often challenged in is how religion is so integrated into other aspects of social, religious, or social, economic, and political organization. So religions are also expressions of values, of ideologies, and cultural worldview, which is why I've placed it within this broader topic of worldview and symbolic expression. And religions have a lot of symbols that they use as well. They're a system of meanings. They rely on schemas, like we talked about last topic. They are a model of reality, of the world, of that which is natural and that which is supernatural. And they're meant to also be a model for life, much like we talked about last class with folklore, about how religions contain a lot of mythologies and stories and parables and fables and tales that are meant to transmit that information about what it means to be a member of that group and what core values are being held. Now, your textbook provides a definition of each of these, and we can look at some examples of these in class, but these are the characteristics that all religions share. And again, they manifest in different kinds of ways, but we see things like taboo come up, that there are restrictions around those activities, actions, and objects that should not be engaged with, where it's inappropriate to do so. Feasting is another key part of religion's consumption of goods, production of goods for consumptive acts are a critical part, as are things like prayer, physiological exercise, and exhortation, or a call to serve the supernatural forces or to act as a mediator. We'll talk about religious specialists in a moment. So again, start thinking about what some examples of some of these characteristics might be. We also have to remember that religion is something that is active, right? That it's behavior at the individual level, and it's as individuals we participate in rituals, and yes, they have a group component, but ultimately there are responsibilities and actions of individuals in it. And again, some religions seek to enhance the individual experience, and others focus on again a more of a shared and collective experience. So there's variations in this, but ultimately it comes down to the actions of individuals. So what then is a ritual? Well, as stated here, I think this is a really great definition: a repetitive social practice. But it's not an everyday routine, right? So it's not, well, I get up in the morning and I brush my teeth. That might be, we call it a morning ritual, but in this context, we're talking about rituals in a religious context, right? And there's symbolic activities, right? And this is how, again, a ritual in a religious context is different from what we would conceive of as an everyday ritual, right? That the activities that are being performed are symbolic. So they have meaning beyond just simply the act that is occurring in there. They also adhere to the ritual schemas that exist within that society. So these schemas allow us to recognize when something is a religion, right? So we know there's a difference between an individual who sets up maybe their table in a certain way before they eat, as kind of a standardized behavior, but it lacks some of the schematic principles we would expect to see around a ritual, right? And we would know that something's different. And so that's one of the ways we can identify what rituals are as an anthropologist, is looking for these schemas and attempting to identify them, right? These patterns of symbolic behaviors. So what we'll do in class on Friday is go over this definition a little bit more, and I want to break into these different sections a little bit. And again, here's where we have that explicit connection to myth, right? Is that rituals serve a function of reinforcing these cultural narratives, right? These ideologies, these worldviews that are associated with it. Now, while rituals vary cross-culturally, something that doesn't, one of our cross-cultural universals that we have are rites of passage, and all societies have rites of passage. And studies of rites of passage have demonstrated that the cross-cultural studies, so ethnologies of rites of passage, have demonstrated that there are always three steps involved in which where we mark the transition of an individual from one status or social position to another. And so in class, we'll go over some examples of these, and I'll illustrate, for example, how a graduation or a convocation ceremony has these three stages associated with them. But think about other rites of passage that you have engaged in. Again, what are other occasions under which you have marked this movement from one to the other, right? So weddings, bar bat mitzvahs, lots of coming of age ceremonies, so quinceaneras, et cetera, et cetera. There are also rites of intensification, and these I just put as a note that the rites of passage are not the only rites that exist, but it's one I want to focus on just because it's so critical, and all societies share these in different ways. Rites of intensification happen when a religious group is facing either a real or potential crisis. So they are rituals that promote cohesion and solidarity within group members. It allows group members to find comfort in their faith, brings them again together as a community of practitioners, and distinguish them as such. Oops, sorry. So again, I already mentioned this, that, this means that religions have a very active component that can be either individualized or focus on the group itself, but ultimately there is this social component, right? That they all involve social interactions and organizations that provide structure, that provide these narratives, that oversee the performance of ritual to ensure that proper protocols and whatnot are being followed. And then also as individuals, in many cases, the only action that we are required to doing is simply experiencing it, right? So being part of it. And what that experience is can vary. But what we do know is that humans are equipped for religious experiences, right? So you can think about, the hair standing up on your arms or the back of your neck, our ability to control our rate of respiration. So in the act of prayer or meditation, where we're intentionally slowing it down and being aware and internalizing and thinking about a sense of calm, right? We have this capacity to do this. Now, one of the things I mentioned off the bat is that religions are defined because of how they provide rules and instructions in relation to that which is supernatural. So how do anthropologists define supernatural forces? And I think this is interesting because it both kind of reinforces sometimes some of the cultural learning we have, but also provides a different framework. So when we talk about supernatural forces broadly as anthropologists, we're talking about those supernatural forces, right, that have no person-like character, right? And so this could be this could be animism, the belief in souls, right? Souls don't necessarily have to have a person-like character per se, but they can just be an essence, again, a force that inhabits living objects, or sometimes even inanimate objects as well, can still be seen as having this kind of component, this force, this, again, soul-like substance to them. Or we can have animatism, which is the belief in just kind of entirely impersonal forces themselves. Sometimes supernatural forces can also take the shape of just things like mana. And so this is similar to, but a little bit different than how you might have encountered it in video games, right? It's just this understanding that some objects have a power associated with them that others do not. And this is often where symbols become really important, right? Because it's often symbolic items that are thought to contain mana, right? So think about holy water, for example, is water that contains a power that other water does not, right? It has this force, the supernatural force associated with it. And many religions, of course, then have taboos, or again, these restrictions, these regulations around not only, which forces can be interacted with, but also who is permitted to interact with these objects, to interact with them and engage with them. We also have supernatural beings, right? So not all supernatural forces are impersonalized. So we have those of non-human origin. So we can think about gods and deities. They're often named personalities associated with the creation events, creating the world, responsible for overseeing aspects of our existence. And then we have spirits that are a little bit closer in kind to human. And again, spirits can take a number of different forms, including ghost and ancestor spirits that do have a human origin, or we can think about spirits and other kind of supernatural beings like angels, for example, that are closer to humans, but not quite human at the same time, right? Now, what's interesting about ghosts and ancestor spirits is that most societies have some belief or understanding of these existing, and all societies have an understanding of supernatural forces to some degree or another. And again, why we use the term supernatural beings is that usually these are what we call anthropomorphic, or in the shape of humans, right? So anthro-human, morphic shape. So in the shapes of humans, are conceived of in the image of people. We see them represented as such. So we have these different kinds of supernatural forces and beings that we can interact with, but there's also religions outline the ways in which we can engage with the supernatural. So because feasting is such a key part of most rituals, feasting and also sacrifice, so that giving up of something is a critical piece of this. We have prayer, a mechanism of asking supernatural forces or beings to step in or interact or take action on our behalf. Whereas divination is distinct from prayer in that it is also kind of an asking, but we're seeking answers. So we're not asking a supernatural being to act on our behalf, to mitigate something, to prevent something from happening, to relieve a burden, but rather we're seeking solutions for our problems. What should we do? What are the actions we should be taking? If I want to have a romantic relationship with someone, how do I gain their attention, right? And so this could be anything that is troubling an individual, and then they would seek this answer through the form of divination. Magic is another way. Now, so we can have asking and we can have seeking questions. We can asking with the expectation of there being an outcome or of the supernatural force or being responding in kind. We can be asking questions and seeking direction in that way. But magic is meant to compel the supernatural to act in intended ways. So this is not about asking or persuading. This isn't about seeking answers, but this is having the supernatural force intercede on our behalf, right? Or being on our behalf. And magic, and in order to compel then the supernatural, involves the use of rituals, right? And so voodoo or voodoo is an excellent example of a religion that is strongly, where there's really explicit rituals that are associated with this particular practice of magic. And again, we can talk about this more. Now, magic can take a number of different forms, so I just want to give some examples. And the reason why I do this is because I think our understanding of magic, and we'll talk about witchcraft and sorcery, has been very much influenced by popular culture. And I just wanted to make some distinctions between, again, how anthropologists approach these topics and have traditionally defined them based on our cross-cultural studies on this subject versus, again, more popular cultural understandings of what this means. So we can have things like imitative magic. Usually when I'm in a classroom, I do an activity where I do some hunting magic. I give an example of what it would be like to, you draw yourself with a bow or an arrow or a spear, and then you draw the animal that you intend to kill or hunt, and then you draw the spear going into the side right where the heart is. And the idea is that if you follow all the right procedures of this ritual, of this cave art, of this hunting magic, then you'll have the intended outcome, because the supernatural forces will be compelled to act on your behalf and to ensure that your arrow or your spear or whatever meets its mark. Contagious magic is, on the other hand, is based on the idea that once things are put into contact with each other, they can continue to influence each other after separation, right? So we can imbue an item and invoke a supernatural force through it and compel it to act. And then when we take that item with us outside of the religious context, it continues to have the ability to have that intended effect, and indeed to then influence and affect other individuals who are not explicitly associated with that particular rite or ritual, right? So voodoo is a good example of how contagious magic is often used. Okay, now one of my favorite topics, and I want to talk about this, folks, with you in class, because I've been accused of witchcraft twice. And so one of the optional resources for this class is the TEDx talk I gave about being accused of witchcraft, and how it helped me understand better this understanding of witchcraft and why it, and the function and value that it serves in society. But I'm jumping ahead a bit. So first we need to make a distinction between sorcery and witchcraft, because often what we see in, again, popular cultural narratives as that's defined as witchcraft is more what we would define traditionally anthropologically as sorcery, right? The use of spells, chants, materials, objects, and medicines to, again, compel or invoke these supernatural forces. And sorcery, therefore, it often is accompanied by evidence. Where witchcraft, on the other hand, is performance of magic by means of thought and emotion alone. And this actually can occur even at a subconscious, or in some cases unconscious level, that the act of even dreaming something and then it happening, it becomes an act of witchcraft, right? It's thought and human emotion alone that is generating this outcome in the physical world, right? However, detecting this becomes a little bit more challenging, right? How do you prove someone is conducting witchcraft when even they themselves may not be aware that their thoughts, that their emotions are creating these negative events? And notice that we tend to focus on negative outcomes here because that's where a lot of the accusations lie. Your textbook actually gives a lovely example of trying to explain, well, why does witchcraft persist and what are some of the functions and roles it plays? And it looks at actually some really early kind of classical anthropology through the ethnographic fieldwork of E. Evans Pritchard and his work among the Azande population. Douglas talks about, and we'll talk about these more in class, talks about the range of witchcraft accusations in the world. So what motivates people to make witchcraft accusations, and it often comes to either increasing group solidarity by marking someone as an outsider or causing again, fraction within a community because of accusations and processes. And then I'll share my experience of being the second time I was accused of witchcraft and some of the, again, how it helped me understand this practice of witchcraft and why people use it, why it's such a powerful mechanism, especially when we start to think about things like power, that witchcraft is often a means for people who feel powerless in scenarios to seize some of that control, right? They don't like what you're doing, then they accuse you of witchcraft. It's hard to prove, but once that accusation's been laid, that distrust has been laid out there, and it has consequences. So we'll talk more about this in class. I feel obligated to mention this just because I've had many students and I have friends and colleagues who identify as Wiccan, and I just want to distinguish that. And also indicate that a contemporary understanding of Wicca, while I mentioned that, you know, witchcraft is used predominantly to cause harm or evoke harm, Wicca is not harm-based, right? Instead, it focuses on, as I mentioned here, things like harmony with nature, on understanding and navigating supernatural forces with both feminine and masculine essences, with the goal of upstanding these main virtues of truth, honesty, and integrity. But again, it has many key components that we would expect to see in a religion, so it is one as such. But I just wanted to separate that because some people are just like, well, what about Wiccans? And I'm like, yes, you're right, absolutely. Wiccans do not intend to do evil or harm, generally speaking. Again, it tends to be, as I think, ultimately, most religions focus on good versus bad, although, of course, how individuals interpret religious practice and texts and whatnot varies a little bit. Something else we consider as anthropologists is, well, this idea of interacting with the supernatural, because some religions have rules around who is able to engage with supernatural forces. And in many times, it's supernatural specialists or religious specialists who have the sole responsibility of performing this on behalf of their groups. And here's just a list of some of them. And again, we can look at these different terms in class and look at different examples, but you'll see there's different kinds of roles shifting between full to part-time. Sometimes they're gender-based as well, and they have different kind of functions, right? So some play a critical role in officiating public rituals and events. Others are focused on things like healing and health, and then others may be focused on more negative aspects. And again, a lot of these come from kind of traditional anthropological understandings and may not reflect all contemporary contexts, right? Okay. So once anthropologists understand what religions are, and we've developed some of these takeaways from our ethnology of world religions, is now to look at one of the other big questions is, well, why do all societies have religions? And there's been so many theories that have come up to interpret these. And again, we can talk about these more in class. A lot of these just simply come down to these explanations of why religion's universal. All societies have religions is simply because as humans, there's a compelling need we have to understand the world around us, right? We want to know why we're here. We want to understand things that are unknown to us, forces of nature, death and dying. Why do people get ill? Sleep and dreams. Sleeps and dreams are really interesting because we know humans need to sleep and we know we dream, but we haven't quite figured out the whys of that yet. So religion actually might provide a mechanism for explaining these different things. Again, many religions explicitly talk about what happens after we die and gives reasons for why we may die. So, and causes for death, for example. So that's one way we can approach it. Other people, again, influenced by other disciplines like psychology, have looked at and made arguments that religion's universal because of a revision to childhood needs, that as we age through our lives, increasingly as we take on adult responsibilities, we use religion to serve as a form of parental care and safety and comfort and support for us. It's something we can look to for guidance. I always joke when I'm at a playground, I'm always looking around for who's the adultier adult than me in the room. And it's kind of terrifying when you look around, all of a sudden you realize like, oh, I am the adult. I am the only adult. Like I'm in charge of all these decisions. And so being able to look to religion for that safety and comfort might be one explanation for this. And some of it's based in ideas that Freud generated and whatnot. And sometimes we actually see this mirrored in the religion itself by through the use of things like referring to the creator as our, or a creator as our father. Some of the explanations that I like that are interesting relate to things like, again, kind of building upon this idea of anxiety and uncertainty and the fear of the unknown or not knowing about the unknown, is that religion can serve to allow us to cope, to address what to do and what we should do, or to seek comfort in times of stress, because scientific knowledge alone, as Malinowski argued, is not sufficient to prevent illnesses, accidents, and natural disasters. And indeed, actually, witchcraft accusations amongst Azadi is a good example of this, that when bad things happen to good people for no other reason, well, then you might turn to the supernatural and go, well, supernatural's fault. Right? The reason why that granary fell on those people when they happened to be sitting underneath it was because someone was thinking ill of those individuals. And so that was the response of the supernatural forces through that act, or through being compelled to act in a certain way. The example we'll talk a little bit more in class is the work of Pogny and Polnack, looking at taboos amongst New England fishermen. And this is interesting because, again, it looks at kind of some of the concepts associated with religion, but separates it from any particular religion, but rather looks at the role of taboo, these kind of rituals of avoidance, and how they're understood to help keep sailors safe in very dangerous deep water fishing adventures. The other thing we can talk about as well that I thought I'd introduce, again, just because I like to bridge together topics and weave them together throughout the term, is that there's been some recent studies that have looked at, such as Gershwin in 2016, looking at and this is by an economist, not an anthropologist, so I don't actually agree with all of their conclusions, but I think it's just interesting that this economist was attempting to understand, well, why do people believe in witchcraft, right? And what they found was a strong correlation between beliefs in witchcraft as harming forms of economic progress, right? And we can talk about this about how it serves to erode social capital. And again, from an anthropological perspective, I say, well, that's kind of the point of it. That's why. It's a really important mechanism for power. For reclaiming power when you feel powerless, and dealing with things like inequity that persist in societies, particularly economic disparities. Because again, many of us who might think, harmful thoughts about people who are better off than ourselves, especially if we're continuously being beat down by them. And sometimes that satisfaction that comes when we see people fall from high status positions is linked with some of the kind of ideologies around witchcraft. So we'll talk about more of this in class on Friday. So looking forward to chatting more about all of this with you in class.